afternoon, and very glad to see everyone back from lunch. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. It's a pleasure to open now this session and to be joined by such a distinguished panel. We're fortunate to have with us Professor Gilles Duranton from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Edward Glaeser at Harvard University, Professor Namrata Kala at MIT Sloan and the IGC, and then our practitioner, Mr. Mohammed Adjei Sowah, the former mayor of Accra and an experienced urban practitioner. Thank you all for being here. So let me start with a simple point that you already discussed in the morning. Cities are engines of growth. They bring together firms, workers, and ideas. And they have enormous potential to generate more and better jobs. But that potential is not automatic. I work on South Asia. I'm the chief economist of the World Bank of South Asia. And I see it every time I travel. Cities need to function well to deliver on this promise of more jobs and more growth. And that matters more than ever now, because over the next 2 decades, the working age population of all ages is going to increase by about 700 million people, almost all of them in developing countries. The question is whether cities will be able to provide enough jobs and the right kind of jobs for these new entrants into the labor market. And the evidence suggests that this is not guaranteed. In a significant number of developing countries, periods of strong growth have not translated into more jobs. It's what we've dubbed in one of our papers, jobless development. Workers are leaving agriculture, that works fine, but then the urban sector, the cities, don't create enough non-agricultural jobs to absorb all these workers. So with that in mind, let me frame our discussions around 4 broad questions, which I believe will be shown on the screen behind me. Not yet, okay. So I will just start with the first question. There we go. One is about how urban labor markets function in low and middle income countries. Then the second one is what limits the spatial, the agglomeration benefits basically in cities in South Asia. And the final question is about supporting urban labor markets, efficiency versus equity. So what policies can help? So let me start with the first question to Ed and to Sowah, if I may. So cities are supposed to generate agglomeration economies by bringing firms and workers together. But do urban labor markets function this way in low and middle income countries? So perhaps, Ed, you can talk about what should happen, and Sowah, you can talk about what does actually happen in these labor markets.
So, my own work in Brazil, we find when you look at initially poor workers and you watch them come to cities, and we see a very different experience in northern and southern Brazil. In southern Brazil, the cities seem to function much like cities in Spain or cities in the US, in that they provide pathways out of poverty into prosperity. In northern Brazilian cities, you see much less of that. Much more of a sort of traditional, natural resource-based economies. Now, in a correlational sense, this difference is explained by a very simple variable, which is the degree of economic exposure of less skilled workers to more skilled workers. So the firms in the South look sort of like American firms or European firms in the sense that skilled and unskilled workers work together. In northern Brazilian cities, they don't. They have less skilled workers working on their own in a way that doesn't connect. And I think this is a vision which is about, cities are places in which we learn by being around other smart people. I mean, and if you think about sort of just bouncing into people, borrowing ideas from them. I mean, in some sense, our greatest skill is our ability to be intellectual magpies and to steal ideas from the people that are around us. And this is a critical part of how you succeed in life. And I think there's just a larger agenda, which is experience segregation. So we've had a 75-year agenda around how segregated residences are, right? But we're just having a 5-year agenda on focusing on how segregated the adult lives are. And we can do this with evidence on firms, you need administrative data on individual establishments to do that. But you can also do that with cell phones, right? Where you can actually look at how much people move around cities. So in the US, for example, the children who grow up in relatively low income households just experience much less of the city than in high income households. So there's really a severe cliff. And that's even true holding neighborhood constant. the difference between a house at the 25th percentile of home value versus a house at the 75th percentile has a huge difference in just how many restaurants, how many parks, how many entertainment venues they go to. And so in some sense, for me, a successful city is one in which you're bringing everyone together and you're enabling people to learn from one another, and you're allowing people, even if they start with very, very little, to find their future. And unfortunately, too many of our developing world cities are not doing that.
Thank you. Let me attempt to answer the question from this perspective as a practitioner, that city government has a mandate to provide service to the people. And in most low-income development countries where we have cities there, most of them think more of a service delivery instead of providing an economic environment for firms to grow. So the attention of city managers and the city authority is much more on providing service of waste management and electricity, water, education, and less of that of economic issues. And that's one of the challenges that we face in low-income countries. And then, so to be able to work effectively with labor and firms and have a good interface requires a certain change in the mindset and approach of city managers and city government as well. I've been advocating for local economic development to be the pivot of city government. Unfortunately, and that has not been, and that creates some kind of disconnect between the city and what happens within the economic actors within the city space. There again, if you look at the low-income countries, where you have a lot of informal sector actors more than the formal sector actors, because in advancing this argument, the focus has always been more of firms which are more formal, but you have 80% of the labor force in the informal sector, and that's where the focus, in my view, should be. And they are more of sole proprietors and few others. And there's a lot of work being done around that side. And the city authorities work closely with the informal sector actors. But the major problem is the lack of data which is available there. So there are a lot of people that are functioning over there, the economic actors, but they don't have the data to be able to make the right projections and to be able to harvest the economic benefit of it and even to calculate their own GDP. I remember when I was a mayor, before then, we don't know the GDP of Accra, until we had United Nations, one of the agencies that helped us to start, calculating and beginning to make an argument based on some of these things. So the informal sector is essential in this particular discourse, and we have to be able to take note of that. Now, if you want to focus on the informal sector, what are their challenges and what's the relationship between them and then the city government is very, very important. Let me give an example once again. As a practitioner, you have a mayor from a low-income city, and it comes to Europe and probably in America, and it sees very nice tall buildings around. Then you come back to your city, and you think that overnight you have to change, and then you disrupt, your own local economy, which is largely the informal sector. So you then ask yourself, as a city authority within the in a low-income community, how do you want your city to look like? Do you want it to look like New York? You want it to look like Washington or Brussels? Or you want to have your own development path where you recognize all these actors and tap into the economies and recognize them and to be able to work with them, rather than having, disrupt that local economy of more of an informal sector activities that you have over there. So for me, that's where the challenge is, But in doing so, once we recognize that, we'll be able to have a a development path that will be on our own and will be able to tap into the economies of all these people. The last thing I wanted to focus on is when I spoke about the lack of data, and when I was a mayor, one of the things that I started advocating for is that in our country, one good thing that we've done is that we have a Ghana card where every Ghanaian should have a unique ID. That's what you have in the States now. But that ID does not determine or tell whether this individual, who he is, and the firm that he works in, what kind of expertise does it bring on board? So if you want to focus on the informal sector, where I spent a lot of time working with them, it was different that, okay, let's also register all the market women that you have, all the traders that you have in the market. And to be able to uniquely identify them, the space where they are, and the work that they do, it will help you to also tax them as a city authority and also to know what they are doing. You can see that somebody will be selling something small somewhere, but he's been able to use that money that he gets from that business to pay the fees of his kids, build a house, and build his own economy, and that's what we're trying to do. If you move around the city of New York or here, you will find similar activities over there. The city knows those who are doing that kind of business, but in our part of the world, we don't know those who are doing the business. So the interface between the workers and those small micro firms that are available is also missing. And the data is very important for us to be able to understand these work that they are doing, and then we can have a forward march on the things that we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sowah. So this was interesting as to the way you put it, that the cities are so busy providing basic services, they don't have much time to focus on what you're saying, what makes the city work, which is to bring people together. So maybe I can turn now to Namrata and to Gilles about what is it that prevents cities from bringing people together to get this spark that you were talking about, that we piggyback on each other's ideas. What is it that prevents cities? And maybe if in your remarks, you could also touch on what Sowah mentioned about informality. Is there something special about informality that prevents cities from working?
Sure, I can start. Yeah. So, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me to be here today, and just a little shout out to the World Bank Research Group, because a lot of the papers that I'll be citing, come out of the research group here. But let me just start by kind of echoing what's been said before, which is the role of proximity and this kind of decades-long work across many contexts that tells us that proximity matters to good jobs, to good information, to good suppliers, and so on. And so we have a lot of work on this. In the developed world, we have less but growing work on this. In the developing world, and ex ante, it's not clear if the same types of relationships will hold, because frictions might exacerbate or compensate. But now we know that proximity does matter. So there's great work by Anna Vitali, who has work on firm clustering in Uganda. I have some co-authored work that shows that when the government, not us, when the government randomly places firms with input-output linkages close to each other, that has long-term implications for firm survival. So we have good causal long-term estimates of this now, which brings us to the question of why isn't the city reallocating itself to make this proximity optimal and matter? And the first thing that, of course, comes to mind is land market frictions. Those tend to be large and important. I know that Gilles has a lot of work on this, and I hope he'll talk about some of this, but especially I think the work in India shows how very important these market frictions are. I think for me, I'd like to quickly touch on frictions that are specific to labor markets, like search and signaling frictions. And there's a lot of work that shows that looking for a job in anywhere, but also in a developing country, is a costly, uncertain process, which means that many people either give up hope or settle for a job that's not the best match. And so there's work out of, Carranza et al. In the AER that shows in South Africa, when you relax these signaling frictions, you lead to better outcomes for workers and better matches for firms. So I think the fact that these frictions exist is well known. We have some excellent evidence that shows that they can be relaxed, and that leads to better firms and workers. And I think this, why these frictions tend to persist, I conjecture that informality is actually one step or one part of the puzzle. So in India, around 85 to 90% of the workforce is in informal employment. These are large numbers. And so what informality does is it's hard for me to signal my type. It's like if I'm in these like short-term jobs that don't last very long, which makes it hard for me to retain a job as well. And the consequence of some of these frictions tend to be that a lot of hiring happens in networks. And there's a lot of excellent work that shows that networks lead to great important information being transmitted, but that because they're overcoming a friction, we're not always able to get to the optimal outcome. So there's work that shows when you compete for jobs, you don't share that same information, and that's going to have consequences for labor markets. So network-based hiring is important and helps, but is not a substitute for excellent labor market policies. So I'll stop there.
Okay, let me try to bring yet another perspective on this. So I think if there's one constant in city management the world over, rich and poor countries, it's this tension between land use planning and transportation planning. And they tend to speak past each other a lot of the time, and sometimes one group has the upper hand. And I think at the moment in developing countries, the current mood is indeed to bring people to jobs. So that's a transportation problem. And there's nothing wrong with that. That means, I think, in practice for accessing jobs, it means improving the road. Improving the road is a complicated thing because roads, they're used to carry people around and they get really congested because there's not that much of them in many parts of the world. But there's also a bigger issue behind, which is with public space. So traditionally, roads in many parts of the world are to be shared between vehicles and people and children playing and animals resting and all those things. And, it's a perfectly legitimate way to think about that. But that, of course, is not very helpful for traffic. So moving to a traffic-only equilibrium, may or may not be fully desirable. And for that, you also need to improve those roads and upgrade them and make them at least whatever secondary or primary roads. That doesn't solve the problem because, of course, as you offer better roads, I think Matt Turner and I did that many years ago. As you provide better roads, you will attract more customers for those roads, especially because they don't have to pay. So the other problem is more institutional to actually bring people to jobs, which is there's a huge reliance on informal transit, which means not informal, but in the form of private transit, which is great. But the real issue here is that this turns out to be really costly for low-skill jobs. Going back and forth, especially if you have whatever 2 connections, you're going to spend whatever a third of your daily wage in transportation. So that doesn't make it easy to bring people to jobs. Then you try the other alternative, which I think is not in fashion because there's a big complication behind, is to try to bring jobs to people. That's a land use problem. And the problem is that in many parts of the developing world, you have huge parts of like the south of a city or the north of a city, which is all informal or mostly informal. And informal means residential, low-rise, everything, all the land being well occupied, so there's very little room for anything else, essentially. And of course, there's the issue of slum clearance and all the problems that this is raising. So that's reasonably well complicated as well. But I think we need to do both ideally, because only bringing people well to jobs is probably is in many parts in many parts of the world is really tough. Then on informality, I'm going to say something very, very simple, which I think that informality, there's weak institutions, weak governments that at the same time think they are way stronger and way richer than they really, really are. I could tell you all sorts of really horrible things about the recent labor reform in Colombia. Again, like they think they're Sweden and they're Colombia, and it doesn't work. And what you end up doing is push towards more informality as opposed to try to formalize workers weekly. They're imposing things that even the French government, well daring to do. So that's a pretty sad story of informality, where we try to have I'm a closet decolonial, maybe, and we are trying to many of those places are trying to imitate the really rich world, but they're not that rich, so they probably need to find another path.
Thank you. This idea of bringing people to jobs, or jobs to people, but it sounds like you're more in favor of people to jobs, and informality is an obstacle because informal transport, for example, is expensive. It's more expensive than a government-provided kind of transport. But maybe it's also a question of the right people, which takes us to our next question. What kind of skills do firms in developing countries, cities need today? Are there shortages of skilled? You hear both sides, actually. When I travel to South Asia, I hear both sides. There's shortages of skilled workers, and then you hear of the people who are the taxi drivers who are way overqualified. No? So you hear both. Which is it of the two? So maybe I can ask Namrata and Ed. Maybe we should start with Ed.
Okay. I'm going to abuse the question. I will say something about this, but I actually want to make 3 points that relate to things that have been previously said. The first thing is I just want to follow up on the mayor and just repeat a mantra I have about dealing with local governments throughout the world, which is in state and local government, like capacity eats policy as a light snack. Okay, and the point of that is you may have 37 ideas of things that you think the mayor should be doing, but the mayor is drinking from a fire hose. Okay, the mayor's got 1,000 things going on, and he's got 3 people who'll do anything that he says, and consequently, his ability to implement your far-reaching reform is really kind of limited. So I think that's sort of a really critical thing for thinking about anything that you actually want to do in developing world cities, whether or not it's about creating upskilling programs or improving public transportation. Second point is often the barrier to interactions have to do with things like rule of law. And I'll just give you an example from my own work, which is on entrepreneurship in Zambia, where female entrepreneurs frequently have difficulty working with male entrepreneurs because the male entrepreneurs are often abusive, as men have often been throughout history. And consequently, we find that we can actually get more trust and more cooperation when you have things like market chiefs who actually protect the interests of the people who get involved with partnership. And so rule of law is a strong complement to urban interactions, which is why, our first codes that we have of law are things like the Hammurabi's Code, which is a deeply urban code. And the third point is, and I think I really want to sort of echo things that were said earlier about, the trying to do Germany in Colombia. I don't think this is just a developing world thing. I think we have a thing around the world in which governments act, and no government is more guilty of this than the U.S. government. Governments act as if they're in a regime of extreme abundance, where they're actually living in a world of a great deal of scarcity. Right? And so there's a relatively limited set of things, right? If you're going to try to engage in redistribution or protecting things, you need to really recognize what the costs are going to be of that, because it's not free. In the US, for example, we do this work on road roughness, where we estimate using Uber data, using vertical acceleration roughness everywhere in the US. And we find in 8 out of the 11 cities where we have data on subsequent repaving, there is zero correlation between repaving and roughness. So we are repaving the smooth roads just as frequently as we are repaving the rough roads. That occurs mostly because they have a fixed schedule. So every road is supposed to be repaved, call it every 18 months. How many do they get to? Well, a third of the roads. How much targeting is there within that third of the road? None. Okay? And so that's the usual thing that says, we have the resources to do everything all the time, but we don't. And then we put very little effort into thinking about where are we going to target the very limited resources that we're going to do. I think the essence of your question on skilling is we don't have enough of the right kind of skills, right? We've delivered a lot of skills that aren't that valuable and may not be so good at delivering skills that are valuable. And that's, of course, a U.S. problem as well. And I think what we need to do is we need to be just more aggressive in thinking about things like targeted vocational programs that actually can respond nimbly, can be evaluated. In fact, the beauty of vocational training is you can have it pay for performance, because you actually know if someone's been taught how to become an electrician or a coder or a plumber when they graduate. And so you can actually pay for performance, and you can actually have private companies or labor unions or whoever you want compete in this market to deliver these skills. And so I think thinking about things that are sort of more flexible than our traditional K through 12 and higher education to actually respond to the skills need in the moment, that sort of sounds right to me. But then again, all I'm really advocating for is more randomized controlled trials about this type of skill.
Great, yeah, that's right. So I think my sort of takeaway about like skills and whether it's the skills that are lacking or just like too many skills floating around, not being matched appropriately, is I think skilling really matters, but if there's like one takeaway from the evidence that we have, it's that the type of skill that's a friction varies across contexts. So for example, there's excellent work that shows that in Uganda, vocational training has long-term effects on earnings and employability. In South Asia, the heterogeneity in outcomes across vocational training is a lot larger. So I have worked with employed workers in garment factories where we find that soft skills training increase their productivity by about 11 to 12 percentage points, which is large in that context, but it increased their wages by much less. It did increase their wages, but it increased their wages by much less. Right? There's work out of Latin America and a lot of work from the World Bank that has looked at different types of training programs for entrepreneurs, managerial training, different types of soft skills training, etc. And that finds, again, a heterogeneity of effects, some positive, some negative. So what I take away from this literature is that the basic economics of there existing a skill friction, which is then leading to suboptimal labor market effects, happens in a lot of different places. But we need to understand the local context before advocating for one particular type of skill training program than the rest. I'll say sort of a couple more things. So usually, when you present a paper, you have to have like 57 robustness checks, but when you're on a panel, you can say, I wish there was more work on blah. So I think in my reading of the skilling literature in the last decade or so, something that I wish there were more work on is combining the skilling literature with the job ladders literature. And I think that would be super valuable because when we try to understand what do job ladders in developing versus developed countries look like, what we have evidence of is which shows that there is twice more churn in developing country jobs than developed country jobs. That's not a bad thing per se. But what the authors also show is that it's all coming from what they call low quality employment, so like self-employment or low wage labor. And what they also show is that if a person in a developing country job moves from a low wage to a high wage job for 1 quarter, the likelihood that they slip back into a low-wage job is 30 to 40 percentage points higher than a worker who made the same transition in a developed country job. Right? So what this tells me is that when we think about skilling, it's worth thinking about, when we relax these entry-level skilling frictions, what's the next step into like a sustainable higher wage job, and what is the government's role in that, and what is the private sector's role in that? And I think we don't have enough work on this. There's like a little, although again, every time I say we don't have enough work on this, someone's like, well, I sure. So if you've done work on this, please come and talk to me after. But there's some work that shows in Brazil when you solicit private firms' input into skilling, that improves outcomes for workers. So I think that's one way to reduce the lag between knowing which skills matter, involving the private sector, and then easing that transition. So I think that's one of the things I like.
Thank you. Let me hear the practitioner's voice now, because we heard that there is a mismatch in the skills. And workers need to be brought together with jobs. But what's the role of cities in this? What do urban training programs, how can they match the needs of firms and workers?
Thank you very much. I think that I want to put it in context that for low-income countries, we need to do a content analysis. What kind of skill do we need? Because we appear to be borrowing a lot from the global north, and an attempt to implement it back in our part of the world has not been that successful. So the first thing for us to do is to ask ourselves, what kind of skill do we need? What kind of development paradigm are we following? And we need to find a skill to match that kind of development, because we are living in a very competitive world. There are things that you can do better than other countries can do, so that you'll be able to produce more like that. Let me take a step back. Before 2017, we have high illiteracy rate in our country, Ghana. Then a new president took office and said that senior high school is going to be for free. So, and it's been for free till now. The World Bank acknowledged that this is the single most impacted and social policy that has ever been implemented in Africa. And today, it is very difficult to find a very young person that you are looking to become a caretaker in your house or to do, a menial job in your house in Ghana, because everybody is going to school one way or the other. But then you move a little bit high to more specialized skills. What kind of specialized skills do we then need? And let's see what our universities are also churning out in front of us. Because we looked up to the global north and see everybody in suit and tie. So every young person aspiration is go to a university to go and learn marketing, human resource. So there's a huge mismatch in terms of technical, digital areas, construction areas that we needed so much in our part of the world to be able to fill that gap. An example also is that in the construction industry in Ghana today, and especially in the cities, roofing as it's being done, chances are 3 out of 5 young people that you see them doing roofing in Ghana are coming from Togo and not coming from Ghana. That's how it is, they are all doing, and they work day and night because that's the kind of skill that they specialize in and they are producing, because there's a lot of housing, demand in Ghana today. If you come to Accra, the skyline has changed to high-rise building. So there's a high demand for it. But that is a skill that is very much required, which Togo is now producing more, and we are taking advantage of. So to answer the question, I think that we should get to our universities and our vocational schools to focus more on technical, digital skills, which are very much needed presently than more of the humanities that we are producing out there. And then secondly, what are they going to do, to fill in those spaces as well? The other challenge also in the skilled environment as well, it's a certain high expectation of young people. You spoke about money and how they jump and that kind of things. They have certain high expectation of how much young people should receive as salary. Of course, there are challenges that are confronted with us and, that we need to look at it. So because of that, they are unable even to be able to look for good jobs by themselves or start their own business as well. And then finally, and to link it to what Gilles said about the city space is choked with a lot of businesses, and residencies are now moved to the peri-urban areas. So in the city space, there's a lot of firms, individual big firms are all within the city space. But the residents are living in the peri-urban areas. Now, to move from the peri-urban area to the city center, you need a good transportation system. So in our part of the world, it's normal for somebody to come to work an hour late, just because it's understandable that you will be caught up in traffic. There is no good, transportation system to move you from the peri-urban area into the inner city to come and work and to go back home, to be able to do some of it. So because of that, you are unable to encourage people that, with that specialized skills, because to get rent is very expensive within the city center as well. So these are all factors that are inhibiting the availability of skilled labor within the city space for us to make good use of it. And once the person also gets there's a high demand for it, and the people travel around the world to be able to do it. And then finally, we produce a lot of nurses. And nursing schools are quite a lot in Ghana, and teacher training schools. So there's a lot of nurses that we have that we don't have hospitals to work with. So there's an arrangement with the Caribbean countries now that we are now exporting nurses to the Caribbean countries now. So for me, if a city government or a national government you want to invest, there's too much of nurses. Why won't we direct our resources to another more skilled that we needed within our country. So the mismatch and misalignment of government and then what we produce is what we need to be dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you. I like your idea, the ladder you guys mentioned. It looks like there are two ladders going up different trees. Now, one is the one that employees want, workers want, and there's another one that firms want. And thank you for mentioning land use as the constraint. Because so far we've spoken mostly about the supply side of the labor market, but really these jobs need to be there. There needs to be a ladder to some jobs with jobs in it. So for that, you need firm growth. So what in cities is preventing firm growth?
Okay, first, there's something really key here, which is this debate known as the missing middle, or the missing number of large firms in many, many developing countries. So I understand that in many parts of the world, large firms may not be popular, but they tend to be more productive and a lot more so. And part of it is just coming from scale economies from size, because if you manage 100+ employees, you will have a professionalized human resource department and this and that and stuff, and all of this actually will make you more productive. And we know that, the ratio, even in the most developed world countries, where the ratio of the firm at the bottom decile versus the firm at the top decile is going to be some astounding number like 1 to 4. So these are really, really large differences. So I think many parts of the firm many parts of the world need larger firms. Then, how much of that is an urban question? I don't know. It's true that most large firms or large-ish firms, mid and large firms, are located in urban areas. Does that make it an urban question? To some extent, maybe not. So the case for maybe not is an old joke about Indian firms where they're doing well, but they stop opening new establishments when they run out of cousins to run them in the family, right? So you probably heard that already, but what I want to say here is that that's really a trust issue with weak institutions where maybe the urban aspect is perhaps secondary. At the same time, to some extent it is an urban problem. I think indeed it's a land availability issue. Namrata was very kind to quote some old work that we've done with Artie Grover, and Bill Kerr, where indeed in many parts, in India, there's a big issue where the more productive firms are really stuck where they are and getting access to new land, being able to lease stuff that is more convenient to them, is more suitable to them, is really, really hard because they are either de facto excluded again in those areas that are covered by informal residential housing where there's nowhere to go, or they are regulated out by some regulations that are saying, very neatly, firms will be here and the workers will be there and so on and so forth, and suddenly there's only that much space that is left to firms, and it's not enough, and things get really complicated. Plus, with changes, people speculating that this industrial part will be at some point rezoned residential, so there's no point actually having somebody who's going to stay here for only 5, 6, or 10 years, and so on and so forth. So there's a big also indeed land availability issue for firms to be able to grow.
Thank you. Now, you said one of my subsequent questions was going to be, are there too few firms or too many firms? I think you were saying there are too many. We should have more of the larger ones.
Well, there are probably way too many informal firms and way too few mid-sized to larger firms.
Ed, Namrata, you agree?
I mean, I think the professional hazard of being an empirical economist is that you think so much about relative comparisons that now for me these are the same question. Because if you made the formal sector bigger, then the other sector would shrink, and so but I think that's also my kind of intuition. Yeah.
Okay, then let me hear from the person who's actually done it. What are the things that prevent firms from growing in Accra, for example?
So one of the key things is about the regulatory and administrative environment that businesses operate in. Anybody who does business is a money person. So you want some stability to plan and to do your business. So if the environment is very chaotic, you're unable to plan and then to respond to it appropriately. So one of the key things that you need to look at is the administrative and regulatory environment. We did a study on the resilience of the city, and one of the key things that we found out was the fact of lack of engagement. You know, it's one of the things that is enabled to promote the resilience of the city. So during my tenure as a mayor, I had to continue to engage with all kinds of businesses, micro, small, medium, and big firms at any level constantly, just to make sure that you are able to build a city which is more resilient, you know, because it's extremely important. When somebody is doing a business, and I made mention of the informality and certain an example, small and micro businesses, you know, and is unable to predict that starting my business on this land at this moment and doing this kind of business, it cannot be guaranteed. And by tomorrow, you have a city authority that will come out and say that you have to move. What have you done? So it's more of an emergency or an ambulance situation. That's what we are doing in the city of Accra. So my thinking and my proposal has always been that, you know, first of all, the regulatory environment must be very clear to everybody. And because of the high informality, if you have regulations and you keep it in your office that people don't know, they will not be able to understand and respond to it. So there should be very continuous engagement, even with big firms. Big firms, you know, big banks, they walk into your office and they are unaware of a lot of the things that as a city authority you are doing. So my proposal is to make sure that we democratize the business environment and make sure that we deepen the engagement so that we are able to sanitize and create some stability in that sector. And then finally, as well, if you are operating as well in the city center and there are no policy prescriptions that this area is designated as an economic zone, and this area is more residential, but we have just broad, you know, say that, okay, the whole of maybe Washington, D.C. area, it's an economic zone. And so people are just moving in, and we are unable to say that these particular firms are allowed in these areas. This, in my view, is also not very helpful. And I think that there should be very clear, we should have put clarity on the economic zones and reference to the agglomeration of the economics so that we have clusters, and these are areas that we should know that at the moment there's a big fight within the city, especially the rich areas, because nightclubs are coming up. They are making a lot of noise. Rich people are living in those neighborhoods, and they are also complaining that, no, this shouldn't be. You have not sought our permission to be able to do all these things. How do we respond to some of these things? This is very important for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Transparency is a theme that seems to be coming up. You mentioned the zoning, you mentioned the labor market matching.
While I agree entirely with everything Gilles said, I think I want to note that I disagree with the question, in the sense that I think it's a mistake to look at the static distribution of firms and think that that's how you're going to know what the right answer is. Okay, in the sense that, you know, there are lots of good things about small firms. Certainly across the United States, having lots of little firms is very predictive of which metropolitan areas have been able to succeed over the last 50 years. On the other hand, productivity scales very much up with big firms, and I certainly have argued that one of the things that has held back productivity in the construction sector is that residential construction in the U.S. is dominated by firms with fewer than 10 employees, right? You know what a firm of 7 people doesn't have? It doesn't have a research and development department. And so that's kind of bad as well. But on the same time, the real question is not whether or not there are too many or too few big or small firms in the developing world or developing world cities. The real question is, are we seeing enough small firms transform themselves into big firms? And I think the answer is no, but I think that's the relevant question. And it's very similar to the question about urban inequality and how you measure that. So I have always argued that cities should never apologize for their inequality, right, which has been around forever. It was Plato who wrote that every city of whatever size is in reality two cities, one a city of the rich, the other a city of the poor, and they are perpetually at war with one another, right? Cities are unequal because they are fun places to be rich, and they are less intolerable places to be poor. Right? And so they attract both types of people. But that urban inequality is only acceptable, is only okay, if cities are fulfilling their historic mission of transforming poorer children into middle income or richer adults. And so we have to be looking at what's happening over the life cycle in terms of judging whether or not cities are doing well, in the same sense that a healthy firm structure is not determined by what the static distribution is of firm sizes, but it's determined by whether or not small firms can actually grow and expand and add employment and do miraculous things. And also go bust. Like they do both of these things.
Yes.
I was just going to say, I think one kind of fun fact that Gilles might find interesting is that there's actually a nice paper that shows that when India trade liberalized, it led to the professionalization of family firms. So it all comes together.
Thank you. That takes us already to the second question, which was about should urban policies balance efficiency and equity? And I think your answer is it should not aim for equity, it should aim for efficiency today in order to have more equity or intergenerational equity or improvements in it, even if it's not equity, over time, over the long term. Right?
Yeah, I think that most of the things that I think of as being the most sensible equity investments are actually efficiency enhancing in the long run, such as investing in children, which is really about both. And I think it is really important to think about, particularly in the developing world, right? It's about the future. It's about creating a world in which there are on-ramps for upward mobility for children of rich and poor alike. And I don't see an equity efficiency conflict there. I think both of those things go together.
Gilles, would you agree?
Yeah, even at a more very basic level, one thing that we've learned is that in labor economics is that there's a skill-on-skill complementarity. Both benefits. There's also a capital-skill, capital-on-skill complementarity, right? When we write down the Scott-Douglas production functions, which are not terrible approximations of what's going on in the world, if you manage to get firms that grow, that become bigger with more capital, that's going to raise the marginal product of relevant skilled labor as well. So, and it's in everybody's interest, if the entrepreneur captures a share of the as revenue, a share, as the output, the bigger you are, the better. So I think, everybody has to win. I'm not seeing, any trade-off here. The only political economy I'm seeing in some upper and lower middle income countries is that indeed very cheap and skilled labor has all sorts of advantages when you're middle class because you can buy a lot of domesticity. But I view that as a very small fringe benefits relative to the real benefits that we would get from actually getting these people into something way more productive than they are at the moment, i.e. in larger firms that instead of the informal sector, which is extremely capital poor and skill poor.
Thank you. So that assumes that equality of opportunity is provided, or cities give greater equality of opportunity early on. But is that what urban labor markets do? Do urban labor markets serve the rich and the poor equally, or is this what you said, where what you said earlier comes in these frictions?
Yeah, I think that's like a difficult question to answer because there's so much correlation with skills and other the types of jobs that you're being targeted. But I think what I can tell you is that because networks tend to be key in jobs, including in cities, and I think certainly very important in developing countries, and networks tend to follow a certain structure. So for example, Laurie Beeman has work that shows that networks are gendered and that affects who gets a referral for a job, and then that affects who gets the job. So networks have a particular structure. So that then one implication might be they're not going to overcome kind of just excellent labor market policy that can overcome other information frictions. I think the other thing that I'd just kind of like to pitch for is more attention to governance within the city. And I think there's like lots of excellent work that shows that there's inequality in access to public goods. Maybe that's not per se inefficient, but I think we also, at least, I haven't seen much work on like developing countries, city, like local governments, what increases their capacity and their ability to provide these public goods. And so one example is there's a great study of over 1.5 million neighborhoods in India, where they show that most of the segregation is coming across neighborhoods within a city, right? And that's a level of government that we know quite little about in most developing countries. So I think that would be my pitch, to understand whether this is ex ante, like something that we should change, or how should we change it. We should have more attention to what the governance structure and the incentives of these officials are.
Thank you. That gets even harder then at the smaller level. Sowah, what is your experience?
I think at the heart of this conversation is this efficiency versus equity conundrum, if I may say it that way. I've had Prof that focusing more on efficiency and making very strong argument that they'll be rich and the poor all the times, But I think that what you just said, that governance should be at the heart of this conversation, is very key, because it brings to the fore all these issues about equity and efficiency that you need to be able to tackle both at the same time, because you can't afford to also have inequality, because the consequence of it is social vices, crime, and all these things that are. So whilst you're growing, it's in one direction, you are breeding a lot of social vices that can erode all the gains that you are making as well. So you need to be able to focus on these committees. And let me situate it within the context of low income countries. One of the key things that we do is about inclusivity, which is very important, because there's always a certain mindset, that the rich is always right and the poor is always wrong. So if in front of my house, the rich has a nice lawn and beautiful tree in front of his house, which has, covered the walkway. But if I'm poor and I put a table in front of my house to sell tomatoes or something, the city authority will rush and come and clear me because it thinks that, and I think that is wrong in my view. So if it is a walkway, it should be a walkway for everybody, So in my argument, I'm just saying that once you're recognizing the fact that 80% of your labor force are in the informal sector, then at the heart of your governance structure and policy should be inclusivity, so that you don't exclude those people. It's very important, whilst also focusing on efficiency. And efficiency comes in different forms. I think that you made a very strong argument about, the informal sector and how people think about it. And I said that one of it is about lack of data even in the informal sector. Absolutely lack of data. Once you have data, you'll be able to guide them on their own path. They may be, crawling while others are sprinting. But that is the pace they can also go at a point, so that we'll be able to get there. So my view is that efficiency and equity, must be correlated, and they should be able to work very well within the labor market in the urban center. And at the heart of it, when you have a city authority, as governance, which is extremely important. Thank you.
Sorry, and if I can just kind of add one other quick thing that I think actually brings these two strands of thought together. I think there's one of the useful things I think economists have done is point out that when you have frictions that allow for misallocation of talent, then the trade-off between equity and efficiency is actually not a trade-off, right? If you reduce the misallocation of talent, you increase aggregate productivity. And so Penny Goldberg and Gaurav Chiplunkal have a lovely paper about this in the Indian context.
I think Mayor Sowah raised a really important point. I mean, Ed and I have been arguing pretty strongly indeed in favor of efficiency. what I think there are two forms of equity. There's equity ex ante and ex post. Equity ex post with a lot of redistribution, I think we're not in favor of that, but equity ex ante, where indeed everybody has a voice, there is participation. Of course, it's important, especially because in many parts of the world, there's a political economy where you have the traditional politicians that are coming indeed from the more educated, let's call that elite, and they typically think about people like them and work on behalf of people like them, which is not great for the people, for the 80% who are at the bottom. At the same, and then from time to time, you have an insurgent politician who's going to represent those 80%, but this insurgent politician will come with all sorts of very interesting ideas, if not completely crazy ideas, and that's not going to do good. So we have also this conundrum here where we indeed want a lot of ex-ante equity so that the political process and the participation process will become more reasonable and not antagonistic, like we're seeing in many parts of the world, including actually these days in the rich world.
Thank you. It's interesting how the economists talk about equity and efficiency, and Sowah talks about it's just not fair. Okay, and one theme that I hear from many of you, actually, so you called it transparency, governance, transparency in labor markets. You called it capacity, which I think also goes in the same direction.
It does, but it's a different thing. It's the ability to actually execute. It's the ability to actually make sure you're targeting your road repaving towards something. It's the ability to have the human power to actually make reforms. It's just the ability to do stuff at the government. It's a little bit different than inclusivity, although they can be closely related in the sense that if the community is bought into the government, you can often get the community to do things that you wouldn't otherwise get them to do.
Okay, I think we are done with the prepackaged questions. Now we have time to branch out to some questions that from you. So please, we take 3 questions at a time, and then I will leave it to my co-panelists who decide which ones they want to. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so it's pretty decided. Gilles takes the easy ones, and Ed will take the difficult ones.
Vote on this, and he always gets the hard one.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Hi, my name is Abhishek, and I'm an attorney, and I have 2 questions for 2 panelists. On Namrata's point of homophily in networks leading to frictions in labor markets. So what are your policy prescriptions for reducing that homophily and overcoming that friction? And on Ed's point of lack of targeting and the unpaved roads that you gave the example of. So how much can decentralization of decision making and decentralization of resources contribute to solving that problem? Thank you.
Yes. Should we ask other questions first? Or?
Yes, 3 at a time.
Yes. So my question was the discussion earlier this morning on structural change and right now on jobs. Cities have been treated in a fairly generic way. I mean, cities are obviously not generic. More than 60, my guess is more than half the population, 60-70% of the population, live outside the primate cities. And the condition between the primate cities, especially in small countries, or medium-sized countries, and the rest of the cities and towns are very different. So I was curious, how does this discussion reflect the differences? And let me give you one specific point. I mean, again, it's more or less known in the literature that primate cities in developing countries tend to overgrow, both because of government failures and because of market failures. So, how can that, what are the consequences of that, and how could that be corrected? So, question number 1. Question 2 is on the matter of governance and capacity, and it's actually following up on the earlier question. That is, beyond capacity, the question of authority and unity of authority in the management of cities is a very difficult question in developing countries. And again, how are you sort of addressing that? In case I didn't introduce myself, my name is Ahmed Hassan from the Policy Research Institute of Bangladesh.
Thank you. The lady here right up front.
Good afternoon. Thank you for informative session. My name is Shoyer Khan. I'm visiting scholar George Washington University. I'm originally from Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is urbanized rapidly since 2017, and mostly in capital cities, Tashkent, and secondary cities somehow disconnected, and many people are migrating to capital city, and most of people from urban places and a secondary city also migrate to neighbor countries, Russia or Kazakhstan, and U.S. statistics also show Uzbek people are the most DV lottery applicants after Ghana. My question is to Mayor Mohammed, and from your experience, what do you think the single most important policy mayors actually have to influence job creation in secondary cities, not in capital city, maybe some other cities, to support people not to move to capital city or to migrate abroad? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that I heard a question to Namrata to add something that maybe Gilles can talk about. Do you want to start, Namrata?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two things that are worth kind of pointing out about networks. As I said, the first is it impacts who gets the job. So network structure is a certain way. And the second is if there's competition within networks, you won't get efficient information sharing, right? So even if they weren't structured a certain way, competition would preclude information sharing. So what can we do about it? I think lots. We can start by just broadening networks, so to deal with the first issue, and that would mean that we have less of the first problem. The second, and I think there's been a bit of work towards this, is understand what that information sharing is second best towards. Right, so what is the friction that they're solving that labor market institutions are not solving? And there's some work that's around job search platforms that's trying to understand this and ameliorate it somewhat successfully across different contexts. But those would be the two directions that I would suggest.
So there were... One question was about decentralization, and I think of the question about unity of authority is a cousin question, I think, to that one. I sort of feel the same way about decentralization that Deng Xiaoping felt about public-private partnerships, right? It doesn't matter if it's black or white as long as it catches mice. And it's not like there's a right answer which is always localized or always go in the opposite direction. Right. So, for example, a fact that I'm quite fond of repeating is that the average American transit agency spends $1.05 million for an electric bus when you can buy a perfectly nice 36-foot electric bus from Kia for $350,000. Okay, so we're spending 3 times what we should have. And in our data, 80% of the bus orders are unique, meaning that each individual bus authority in the U.S. is buying and designing its own unique bus. This is nuts. This is an absolute crazy thing, and something that actually consolidated the bus procurement in some kind of way, or better yet, just bought them off the rack from Kia, right? That would be a great move in the right direction. On the other hand, there's certainly advantages of having local governments that can be more accountable and have more citizen voice. So I don't think you want to think of there as being just one right answer. That being said, if we're talking about India, yeah, cities should have more power. Yes, the state governments have too much control, and we'd be much better off if Indian cities could do more for themselves. I don't know if I always believe in unity of authority, though. I mean, I think there are some services which are good to bundle together and some services which are not. I mean, I frequently would actually feel like I want to take away city authority on land use planning for much of America, because when I look at America's cities and towns and what they do, I see the exact opposite of what I would like to do in terms of allowing more stuff. And I think the higher you move, you tend to get more sensible decisions about how much building to allow. So I don't know that there's one right answer on that as well in terms of unity of authority. On primary versus secondary cities, so I typically think we're better off of thinking a city as along a continuum. There's a variable, which is something like size or density or some combination of the two of them, and it varies as you move along relatively smoothly in most places. I also don't think it is obvious that the larger cities are too large relative to the smaller cities. I think it is a no-brainer that there are lots of market failures in urban space. I believe that very strongly. But whether or not those market failures mean that you have too many or too few people in the larger cities is unclear. What I do know is that all of these places need better governance. Right, all of them have externalities are everywhere, and so for that reason, I've sort of long advocated that the vocation of caring for, improving the government of developing world cities is one of the great vocations of the 21st century, and that I sort of believe very, very strongly. I will make one minor addenda to this, which is there are countries in which the capital city is so different, right, just in terms of scale and size, that you sometimes it is a reasonable thing to treat Jakarta as being different than everything else in Indonesia, or Cairo is different than everything else in Egypt.
So, Sowah, is Accra different from the other cities? Is it too large, too small?
Just right.
Just right.
So, it is practically difficult in present terms to even get defined the jurisdiction of the city now, because a couple of years back, where we used to call it peri-urban is now part of the city, so there's a serious urban sprawl in the city center, which is covering almost the entire state, of Accra, and that it's very, disturbing to some of us, because for me, at the heart of it is that good governance should be able to extend to all these places, so that wherever there are people living and there are buildings coming up, we should be able to plan that place very well. So if I can answer that one. But to respond to your question about what is a single policy, in my view, that I think that, will be able to help those who live in the secondary cities, where we call it other peri-urban areas, all right, And Accra is a perfect example. One is that I've always said that transportation is the lifeblood of a city. If you are able to move people freely, either by walking, bike, or rail or bus, it will improve the efficiency of the city and build an economy on its own. The real bottleneck that we have in the city is transportation. And the transportation, I'm talking about infrastructure. I'm talking about, that's road infrastructure. I'm also talking about the availability of buses. So during our time, we provided some good buses to be able to commute people from the peri-urban area to the inner city and back. And it's been said that it is quite cheaper, to use public transport. So that was done. But the idea was for us to move it to the next step of introducing a bus rapid system. And I was the chairman of the board around that time. We could not succeed because the small transport owners called Trotro in Ghana, and we call it Mutata in Kenya and Orisset. They are so powerful, they are so strong, and there's always pushback on that. So the buses are competing with these small, but it's good for a start, because people are now moving from the city, from the peri-urban area to the city center freely. But if you are able to introduce the bus rapid system, that will significantly reduce all the problems that we are facing. And an example is what we have in Bogota. Thank you.
Goes back to your capacity point. Gilles, do you want to come on?
I think Ed did a perfect job answering those questions. So.
Good, and we've had two people patiently waiting here, so we'll take the next.
I wanted to take the former mayor's side and push back against the two professors, and I want to hear from them, because I think they might be kind of glossing over the details. So if you take an economic lens and you think of cities as being the organizational economics, transactions cost lens, you can think of cities as having these congestion costs that do grow as activity grows, but the benefits can be separated because there's a sectoral and other components to that. And the frictions can be separated somewhat. So that gets you to polycentricity. And you do have, which has not been discussed, and Professor Glaeser talked about city size, but also within cities you can have polycentricity. Now in work in South Africa I did with some people at the World Bank, we looked at fragmented cities, but in follow-up work we've also looked at how polycentricity is linked to inequality. And what we find is that places that grew were even further away from the poor, which to me represents a clear equity efficiency trade-off. And I think you might argue, anticipating the reverse, the argument is, hey, you can solve that by dealing with congestion costs with capacity. But then that becomes, how expensive is it to solve the congestion costs versus build a new center? So I just want either professor to push back on that or to respond.
Yeah, thank you for these wonderful presentations. My thinking is around insecurity. You see, part of the push factors regarding urbanization, that's people moving from rural areas. Not all are economically motivated. Let me give an example. In the case of Nigeria, we hear about the Boko Haram factors, of course, community clashes, then extreme religious groups who attack whole communities who don't share their beliefs. So in the face of all this, I'm wondering to what extent can, let's say, are citizens in developing countries prepared to kind of accommodate those who are, let's say, internally displaced, like about 3.7 million currently displaced in Nigeria because of those factors, not just economic, Thank you.
Hi, thanks for a great discussion. My name is Eva Grace. I'm a master's student in International Development Studies at George Washington University. And I'm going to draw from my experience in Tanzania. I'm from Tanzania, and I was educated, my primary and secondary, that is all the way through high school. And in my experience, the education system, and I'll assume it's maybe similar in Ghana and other developing countries, but the curriculum is the education system is very curriculum heavy, which keeps a lot of young people often engaged academically, but disconnected from labor market realities. So many only encounter the skills mismatch after they've graduated. Maybe, let's say, universities, when they begin searching for jobs that may not exist or require different competences. So given that, how much emphasis should we place in developing curricula or adapting curricula to reflect market needs? And can education systems realistically evolve quickly enough to keep pace with the changing labor demands? And my second question would be, in context of Africa's large and growing youth population, who should be the focus of, or the primary target of skills training? Is it students in school? Is it out-of-school youth? Is it women, or is it all the above? And at what stage in education to employment pipeline should these skills training take place in order to have the greatest impact on employability? Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got 3 questions. One is on fragmented systems cities where some people have the friction, the others have the benefit. One was about violence and internally displaced people. And the third question was about an education system that can be agile enough to actually match the labor demand. So this time you get to go first, Gilles.
Okay, so let me start with displaced population, because I understand there's a situation that's bad in Nigeria, but 25 years ago, Colombia, which is a country dear to my heart, where I spent a lot of time, had 5 million people, internal refugees. That was a huge urbanization shock, which indeed, to me, was showing all the dysfunctions that could happen in terms of, indeed, rising informality at several levels on the labor market, on the housing market for sure, people starting to live on hills, subject to landslides and all those problems. So yes, that's something that we haven't talked about today, but that doesn't mean, this is not an important issue, and I'm certainly on board to think that this is really major, and it's been a headache for the the mayors of several large Colombian cities that indeed started receiving within a few years literally hundreds of thousands of people. So that's not that's a big urbanization shock, and they probably did not need that at that space, but it did happen. At some levels, they managed to accommodate, well over the years, the housing will got slightly better, transportation will develop, and so on and so forth. But yes, you have all my sympathy on those issues. City structure, we haven't talked about that, yes. I mean, there's a lively debate in the literature. I don't think I know what the ideal city structure is. My feeling is that if you want to grow really large, you probably need to have multiple centers and sub-centers. But at the same time, the largest city in America, which at some level functions wonderfully, New York City is also uniquely monocentric. So is Paris, France, where I spent some time. So is London in the UK. So yeah, there's a little bit of a conflict here between some shining examples of really large very monocentric cities and some of our thinking which goes like, okay, people cannot commute forever, so we need a system with various sub-centers and so on and so forth. I think what's helping is maybe those cities do not have multiple centers, but there's another form of more diffuse decentralization that actually you and Matt Kahn back in the day talked about, right? Yeah. That is also happening, which I think is also important. So we're still, those facts are somewhere in the head of urban economists. I don't think we have a good articulated answer, in part because modeling those things is just really hard.
So I'm not going to respond spatially at all. I'm going to take a totally different way of responding to you. And look, as usual, I completely agree with everything Gilles just said, and I particularly enjoy him taking us back to Puerto Rico 22 years ago when we were both together and we were presenting that paper. The equity efficiency issues. So I'm not trying to say there aren't policies that don't raise equity efficiency issues in the developing world. Obviously there are. Probably, what I do think is there are lots of policies that in fact work well on both dimensions. In the US, right, my preferred, because I'm not a government official, because I can choose to have one issue that's my core issue, I have focused for the last quarter century on making it easier to build housing, which I think of as being both equitable and efficient. And so, that's an example of something where, and I would take the same stance to what you were saying, without taking any view on polycentric versus monocentric cities. I would say that things to be thinking about in these areas are, do we have stupid land use controls that are artificially pushing things out in different ways? Do we have, better buses in different places that could be moving poor people around in the core area better? All of those types of things are ones in which equity and efficiency go hand in hand. So I think there actually are a bunch of things that you can do in that space that are both equitable and efficient at the same time. But I certainly accept that there are areas in which you do actually have to make trade-offs.
Sure, I'll take the third question. So I think there's first, it's useful to start with the stylized fact, which is a lot of developing country governments have made large investments in a network of vocational training institutes in the last 10-ish years. So I think that's worth pointing out. A lot of resources have gone into the expansion of these networks. The impacts, as I mentioned before, have been heterogeneous, right? So some places it's worked really well, some places it's worked less well. My conjecture, as I said, is that it's worth thinking about how to thoughtfully engage with the private sector to make sure that the skills training that you're getting is actually the thing that firms are hiring on. It can also, if you work through an apprenticeship model, help to reduce hiring frictions that already exist. So some of these signaling frictions about, do I know that the worker is reliable through an apprenticeship training program? The firm gets to test that with the worker, so it can help in that dimension as well. And I think the third thing that I'd like to point out, and this is part of thoughtfully and optimally engaging with the private sector, but is also distinct, is even within the public sector to think about the incentives of the people who are providing the training. And so one small fact is that, and India has thought about this quite a bit, and they've tried to have a model where for vocational training institutes, part of your payment from the government is conditional on getting a job. But you could make part of that conditional on retention, right, up to a certain amount of time. And there's work that shows that job seekers have private information, firms have private information that is not taken into account when the vocational training office says like you should probably match with that firm and so on. So I guess like my 3 answers would be the curriculum is really important. Thinking about how to do this optimally with the private sector is probably worth doing or exploring. And then thinking about incentives is really, really important of the provider, both public and private. And then finally, I think like who should we skills train? What should we skills train in? I think there's like a lot of excellent academic work that's like showing for each data point, like for this population, this matters, for that population, that matters. But this is worth like really engage. It's context specific, but it does matter. Like which skill will bind in a context, it's not known, but there's a lot of great work out there telling us about it.
Thank you. We'll end with the last word from Sowah before we close.
So, just a little bit on the education part, and I want to touch on it to challenge those of you from academia, because I think that she's just sharing her experience of those of us from Africa, our curriculum, the way we are taught in school. You're unable to function properly in practice, because you have a class, a lecture hall with about 100 or more students with one lecture, and you're unable to have a relationship even for them to be able to. So there's too much, and there are no reading materials, just some, PowerPoint, and everybody's supposed to go and read and come. So the moment you step out and come to school in the global North, America or Europe, you are in totally different environment, all together. And I've had that experience as well. I could easily, go to school in Ghana, I'd sit at home and be able to go through everything. But you can't do same. When I went to LSE or you went to Harvard, where they taught you some of these things. So this is more of a challenge to those of you in academia and the World Bank, that you should also focus on not just and governments and economics, but those who churn out the human resource. That is the critical commodity required for any development. How do we manage and reorient them so that the kind of people that they produce are better off, to help their countries, So that's the challenge for the World Bank Group and those of you from academia. And it is a little bit on the my friend from Nigeria and talking about Boko Haram and how it has affected migration. I'm touching on it because it exposes the unpreparedness of a lot of cities, and it is not just Boko Haram. There's a climate-induced migration, from the north to the south in where I come from. There's also even natural disasters. Accra is a low-lying area. Anytime it rains heavily, there's flooding. People have to move and all kinds of things. So there should be a better preparation to accommodate, the influx of people into the city. We are unable to even accommodate the people who are moving into the city just to look for jobs, let alone when disaster struck. So this raises a bigger issue of city management and how we are able to manage people when they come to it. And urbanization is real. And that's how city management has become very critical, because we can't run away from it. City managers must be trained properly to manage the city and be able to project the influx of people and to be able to manage them. So thank you very much, if I may end here.
I'm going to make a 12-second intervention. One, I just want to re-emphasize Gilles' discussion of refugees in Colombia and the experience in Africa. I cannot say how important South-to-South learning is, right? And particularly the dialogue between Latin America and Africa that has been far too absent and is far too valuable. Second point, right? Human capital is the bedrock on which national, local, and individual success rests.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, we shall close, because I believe we are having coffee outside. So thank you very much. It's been great to have you, Gilles, Ed, Namrata, Sowah. Thank you very much for joining me. It's really been a pleasure and an exciting discussion. Enjoy your coffee.